Hey guys, before we get started with today's show, I have some exciting news to share. Your financial pharmacist is now offering fee-only comprehensive financial planning services led by certified financial planner Tim Baker. We're dedicated to serving pharmacists like you who want something better than the status quo. We offer our clients an honest, education-focused approach that is specifically catered toward handling the high-income, student loan-laden, demanding career track of you, the pharmacists we serve. Our goal is simple: to get you from thinking, I don't know exactly what to do with my money, but I know I need to do something, to confidently saying, I know exactly what I need to do month in and month out to get out of debt, save for retirement, and achieve my financial goals. You can learn more by visiting yfpplanning.com. Again, that's yfpplanning.com. You're listening to the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast, a show all about inspiring you, the pharmacy professional, on your path towards achieving financial freedom. Hi, I'm Tim Ulbrich, and on this week's episode, I give my thoughts on the outlook of the pharmacy job market, what to make of the Bureau of Labor Statistics projection for a 3% decline in jobs over the next 10 years, how this impacts your financial situation, and 10 steps to take right now with your financial plan to hedge against job loss or reduced hours. Welcome to this week's episode of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast. My name is Tim Ulbrich, and this week I wrap my arms around what to make of the BLS reported 3% decline. That's the Bureau of Labor Statistics reporting a 3% decline in pharmacist jobs projected over the next 10 years, and the implications this may or may not have on your financial plan. And we're going to tackle this in three parts today. I'm going to present the data that's available and some of the statistics around this as we look at this issue. Then in part two, we'll talk about what to make of this data, my interpretation, and then finally, what this means for your financial plan. I'll talk about 10 steps that I think you can take right now with your financial plan to hedge against job loss or reduced hours. Now, let's start with a few very important disclaimers before we get into the weeds on, I think, what a topic that can often evoke significant emotion for good reasons. And first and foremost, these are my opinions and projections. Yes, I'm going to dig into the data that I think will support my argument. But as you know, as I know, this topic is complex and has many contributing factors when we're talking about the outlook of the job market. I would also reference you to Lucinda Main, AACP Chief Executive Officer, in May of 2019, wrote an article, an opinion piece in the American Journal of Pharmaceutical Education called "It Really Isn't That Simple." And I would encourage you to take a look at that, whether you agree or disagree with parts of that. I think that it's a good piece that helps to shape our mind around the complexity of this issue. Now, other disclaimer here that I think is important is, as we look at the profession as a whole, we of course are generalizing. And this may or may not reflect reality for you, the listener, and your personal situation. Every single one of us is in a unique situation. I think that's one of the challenges that comes with this topic. When you hear statements such as the gloom and doom of the future of the pharmacy job market, well, it depends, right? It depends on your area of work. It depends on the supply and demand of your area of work. It depends on where you live. It depends on your training that you have. So many factors. And of course, here in part, although I'll try to break it down, in part, we're going to be generalizing as well. Now, it's easy to go down the pain train, right? The gloom and doom, whatever you want to call it. And my challenge for you is to join me today in objectively looking at the data and applying it to your own personal situation to make your own conclusions. Not what I say, not what some other podcast or blogger says, but to make your own conclusions and hopefully to even investigate this topic further. The other thing I'll say here before we jump in is that there are some principles for personal finance that are tried and true that should be adhered to whether the Bureau of Labor Statistics is reporting a downward trend or not, even if they're reporting an upward trend in the pharmacy job market over the next 10 years, which is not the case. But if they were, there are some sound financial principles that are true across the board. And we'll talk about some of those in terms of building a solid financial foundation. Now, we've talked about this topic before, right? Episode 58, I had Deeb Aid on talking about how good is the ROI of the pharmacy degree. Episode 122, we had past president of AACP, Todd Sorensen, on talking about what will the future of the pharmacy practice be. But we need to keep talking about this issue. And that's why we're doing it again here today, because as with many things, we're going to see data shift over time, we're going to see new issues that come up. And this isn't something that we should be talking about just one time. Okay, let's jump into the data. I want to talk about data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I want to talk about data from the Pharmacy Demand Indicator, which is published by pharmacymanpower.com. I want to talk about some of the data published by the American Association Colleges of Pharmacy and their graduating student survey around student loan debt. And I also want to talk about some of the data as it relates to the residency match statistics. And I think it will become clear why I'm choosing these four areas as we progress further on this episode today. Okay, so the purpose of this episode is looking at, first and foremost, the Bureau of Labor Statistics data. And that's available at bls.gov. If you Google BLS and pharmacists, you'll find this data specifically. But what they're projecting is a 3% decline in jobs over the next 10-year period for our profession as a whole. And so what this looks like specifically is a projection between 2019 and 2029 of 10,500 fewer jobs in 10 years, 2029, than were there in 2019. Now, this is really interesting, right? Because you start to think about the number of new graduates that are coming out each and every year. You start to think about some of the pressures which are well known on our profession in terms of some of the automation, the technology, maybe perhaps in some areas, the oversupply that already exists. And so when you start to see a continued trend towards graduates coming into the space, new licenses that are granted, but a projected decline in jobs, of course, that's going to raise some concern, and rightfully so. And we'll talk about that more here on this episode. Now, to be fair, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which also reports median pay for pharmacists, this is still pretty strong, upper 120s. Now, we know that of course varies by role, by experience, by training that you have, by geographically where you live, supply and demand. But overall, we continue to see the median pay of pharmacists to be pretty strong. But we can't ignore the fact that there's a projected decline in jobs in our profession over the next 10-year period. Now, I also want to say here, for those of you that are familiar with some of what led to the expansion of the number of pharmacy schools and the expansion of the class sizes for existing schools, that goes all the way back to when there was a projected significant need for pharmacists because of several factors. One, the continued rise in the number of medications that are used by Americans, the aging population of our country, which obviously could further exacerbate the number of prescriptions dispensed and therefore the number of individuals that are needing care from a pharmacist, as well as a projected evolution of the role of the pharmacist, which we have seen play out in some regards, but not to its full effect that was projected. So it's important that we're talking projections here, right? And a lot can change. What we saw there was a projected significant need in the early 2000s that didn't pan out like we thought it would. And so therefore, we saw this change in supply and demand. But perhaps we may see that go the other way, right? What if we had some significant evolutions in the profession over the next 10 years that the BLS is not projecting? We could certainly end up in a situation where we have some demand, or it could go the other way as well. So again, projections, and we don't know exactly what will pan out over the next 10 years. Now, the second data point I want to talk about is from the pharmacymanpower.com, and we'll link to that in the show notes. And this is called the PDI, the Pharmacy Demand Indicator. And unfortunately, it hasn't been updated since the fourth quarter of 2018. But if you look at the last 10 years, we certainly see a national trend towards demand being in balance with supply. Whereas in 2008, this was really closer to having significant, and in some cases, moderate demand with difficulty filling positions. So the difference from 2008 to 2018 is pretty significant. So they look at this on a 5-point scale. And we're currently, as at the last measured data, Q4 of 2018, we're exactly at a 3. Actually, I think it was just below that, like 2.99, which essentially means that we're, nationally speaking, we have supply and demand that has equalized. And of course, we probably have seen that shift. We don't have the data from the PDI, but we probably have seen that shift based on other indicators where there now is more supply than there is demand. So that was a 3 on a scale of 5. But in 2008, this was actually a 4 on a scale of 5, signifying moderate demand with difficulty filling positions. So we saw a 1-point shift on a 5-point scale happen in a 10-year period. And again, if you dig deeper by region, by specific area, by role, you'll start to see some differences. But generally speaking, we can't ignore that. There was certainly a shift that happened in supply and demand. So again, looking at the data here. Now, the third data point I want to look at is the graduating student survey that's published by the American Association of Colleges of Pharmacy, AACP, each and every year. So this is a survey that goes out to graduating students. And one of the questions that they ask on that survey relates to student loan debt. And for the class of 2020, we see that number now inching up in terms of median student loan debt for graduates, all schools, so public and private. Obviously, we see a significantly higher number for private than we do public, but we now are approaching $175,000 as the median debt load for those that graduate having borrowed money to obtain their PharmD. And that's an important distinction because not every graduate comes out with student loan debt, right? So this is not a number that transcends all graduates. The data shows 86% of respondents, and this has been pretty consistent, 86% of respondents report graduating with debt related to borrowing for their PharmD. And of those that do have debt, the median debt load is now approaching $175,000. Now, if we look at this as another data point from the National Pharmacist Workforce Survey, again, we're going to link to this all in our show notes so you can dig deeper and make your own conclusions. This is conducted about every 5 years, and the 2019 data shows us that pharmacists who reported graduating during the last decade reported a median student loan debt at the time of graduation of just over $142,000, which was higher than the median debt at graduation of $82,000 reported by pharmacists graduating between 2001 and 2010. So let me say that those numbers again. For pharmacists that graduated between 2001 and 2010, their mean debt was about $82,000, whereas those who graduated between 2011 and 2019, their debt was around $142,000, just shy of actually $143,000. So whether you're looking at the AACP data, whether you're looking at the National Pharmacist Workforce Survey data, it doesn't matter. You see the same trend of a significant increase in debt load of graduates that far outpaces inflation and far outpaces any increase in tuition that you see across the board as it relates to higher education. Because that's often an argument that you will hear is, well, of course, debt loads have gone up. That's been true of all higher education. It's gone up faster than the pace of inflation. But if you look at pharmacist debt load specifically, not only is it higher than inflation has gone up, significantly higher, but it's also higher than the general trends that we've seen in the increase of indebtedness of college graduates across the country. And so just to give you some data, when we look back to 2010, according to the AACP graduating student survey, the median debt load of a graduate was $100,000. And as I mentioned, in 2020, 10 years later, we're looking at about $175,000 as the median debt load. So a $75,000 increase in a 10-year period. So again, the data, right? We're talking about the data here. So the BLS is reporting a projected 3% decline in jobs over the next 10 years. The PDI, the pharmacymanpower.com, looks like we're certainly moving towards a direction, nationally speaking, of being more on the side of supply more than demand. And then here we're looking at the AACP and the National Pharmacist Workforce Survey that are suggesting a significant increase in debt load over the last 10 years. Now, also important, as I mentioned, the fourth data point I want to consider here is the ASHP residency match statistics. Because, one of the things we want to consider is how many of our graduates are going into pharmacy residencies. Is there a continued increase in that? And how might that be playing into the broader pharmacy job market? And what we see with the match statistics is that it remains difficult with a pretty steady match rate reported of around 65%. So this is referring to those that apply for residency. About 65% of them are successful in obtaining a position through the match. So, overall remains pretty difficult. Interestingly, if you look at the last 5 years, you see that the number of resident applicants climbs from about 5,000 to 7,300 over the last 5-year period, while also seeing a growth in the number of positions that are offered, growing from 3,700 to 4,800. But of course, if we had 7,300 applicants and 4,800 positions, we still see a significant number of people that are applying for residency that aren't getting a position. Now, why is this important to the job discussion? If you think about the timeline of when the match is happening, these individuals are often finding out into late March and April about whether or not they've been successful in obtaining a position. So if we see 35%, let's just generalize this here, 35% of applicants, most of whom are P4 students getting ready to graduate, that apply for and are unsuccessful in obtaining a residency position, they obviously are at a point of time where there's not a whole lot of time between when that decision has been made, when they find out about that, and when they're going to graduate from school. And so that may have implications in terms of delayed timing of being able to find a position and or finding a position in which meets their interests and career goals going forward. So that's the data. Now, the second part I want to talk about is what do we make of this data? So the question here is, what will the job outlook be over the next 10 years, right? And as I've already alluded to, I think that really depends on a few important factors, including, but certainly not limited to, the number of pharmacists that retire, right? This was an important variable that really played a big role, I think, in why we saw what we saw in terms of the shift of supply and demand over the last 10 years. 2008 hits, major recession. Any major recession, you can expect that's going to delay people's timeline to retirement. So one of the questions we still have here, and time will tell with the pandemic, but does the pandemic and the impact that has on financial plans of those that are near retirement, does that impact the number of pharmacists that would have retired pre-pandemic to now where we are, obviously, through a pandemic? So what will happen over the next 10 years? How many pharmacists will retire? We don't know, but will that, be an indicator? Will that have a significant impact on what the BLS is projecting? Number two, perhaps most importantly, is the evolution or not of the pharmacy role beyond the traditional dispensing role. Now, this has happened in some regard. We've got great examples of this happening here in Ohio. But will that continue? And to what level will this continue? Not only in terms of being able to have advanced roles and responsibilities through advocacy efforts, through legislation, through practice acts, but being able to translate those expanded roles into positions that can be justified and that there's a business case for those positions being there. So what will that evolution or not look like of the pharmacy role? And then, I think we also need to look at here, what will be the trend in the average number of graduates? So, standard supply and demand would suggest that there may be some contraction that's happening naturally already of the number of graduates that are coming out, the number of students that are admitted. Will class sizes be reduced? Some colleges have already done that. What will that trend be or not be over the next 10 years? Will it continue where we have perhaps a lesser number of graduates that are coming out over the next 10 years than we've seen over the previous 10 years, of course, with a lot of expansion in class sizes and colleges that have happened over the last 10 years. And as I already mentioned too, I think another important variable we have to look at when trying to answer this question, what will the job outlook be over the next 10 years, is how will residency program growth continue, and can that program growth, will it or will it not keep up with the applicant interest? So here's the reality, is that while globally the data doesn't lie, right? We certainly have seen brighter days relating to job projections, supply and demand, related to student loan debt figures, all of the data I presented. Not all pharmacy students and career paths and opportunities are the same, right? So when you start to break down the data, you notice a few different things, that different career paths have different outlooks. Naturally, right? Those that perhaps complete advanced training, whether that be a PhD, a residency, a master's degree, that certainly may lead to a different outlook. Somebody who's in a health system versus a community setting, somebody who's in ambulatory care, somebody who's in specialty, somebody who pursues an industry fellowship. All career paths have different outlooks, and we need to slice this data a little bit thinner and have better data to help inform some of the career choices and outlooks going forward. Where this data also looks different when you break it down is naturally different areas of the country, based on the number of pharmacy schools, based on the patient population and the needs, based on, of course, cost of living and other things. We see significant differences from one pharmacist to another in different areas of the country, which again make this difficult to generalize. And of course, individual factors, experience, networking, hustle, advanced training, all of those things that sometimes are difficult to measure, which can have a significant impact. And if you talk to 10 pharmacists, I believe you'll get 10 different opinions and outlooks, maybe some similarities there, but 10 different opinions and outlooks on what the future holds because of those nuances that are different. The career path, where they live, their training, and some of those individual factors that I mentioned. So, would I make a recommendation that someone enter the pharmacy profession? And I think it really depends on several factors, of which I'm going to come back to a little bit later in the episode. And I think one of the things that, we can do and continue to work on in academia is that really focusing on helping students get broad career advice, giving them the skills, the advice necessary to help equip them to demonstrate how a PharmD education, how that skill set can be transferable, right? Can translate into other roles beyond what we think about of the traditional dispensing role. How can we create new positions? How can we be flexible in other areas of the healthcare system that could benefit from the role and the value that we know pharmacists can bring and that has been documented in the literature over and over and over again? Other interpretation I have of the data is that I think we are going to see a continued compression on pay where oversupply is prevalent, where automation and technology is threatening positions in certain areas of our profession, where the role is perhaps not evolving beyond traditional dispensing. And so I think we're already starting to see this in some regard. If you look at the 2019 National Pharmacist Workforce Survey, what you'll see there is while it's still a small number, a considerably higher proportion, direct quote from that survey, a considerably higher proportion of full-time pharmacists in community retail pharmacies, approximately 12%, reported a base pay decrease in the past year, compared to full-time pharmacists in hospital settings. So only 12%, but it's important that we're talking about a pay decrease, given that naturally costs of things will go up over time. So I think that's a trend we need to keep an eye out for in the future. I think we're also likely to see interpretation of data, continued stress among pharmacists as they're being asked to do more with less, especially in traditional dispensing types of settings, that could lead to burnout, will likely lead to burnout, could lead to decreased satisfaction with work, and certainly through that could put pressures on one's financial plan, depending on how long they want to do and what options they have beyond that work. So, for prospective PharmD students that are listening, I think this is really true of anybody who's evaluating a career decision. I think you should ask yourself, what's the return on investment of the degree? Looking at all the data that we just looked at, what's the return on investment of the degree? Also, what's the opportunity cost of the time spent getting that degree? And then how does this align with your interests? What's the motivation behind pursuing this degree, whatever that degree would be? And if there were some bumps along the way, how would you feel about pursuing that path? So certainly the ROI on the degree has changed. Again, generalizing here. The opportunity cost, we know what that is given the timeline to degree. But if somebody is passionate about healthcare and what the pharmacy profession has to offer, you look at that alongside of that ROI, alongside of that opportunity cost to try to make that best decision for your goals and for your career path going forward. And so I want to shift here to the third part to talk about what this means to your financial plan. Now, I want to start this by saying for those that are facing a financial hardship or job loss in the moment, I hope you will check out episode 115, where we talked about strategies to handle student loans, to handle healthcare expenses, and other things that come along when you're dealing with a financial hardship or job loss. And before we jump into, some steps that I think you can take to essentially help hedge you against some of the negative aspects that can come from job loss or reduced hours, I think we first have to ask some questions and reflect on some questions that will help inform how you shape your financial plan around this. Number one, how much do you enjoy your work? Are you somebody that graduated a few years ago and you look up and say, I love what I'm doing, I can do it for another 30 or 35 years? Or are you wondering, how in the world am I going to do this for another 30 or 35 years? Again, that might shape how you address certain parts of your financial plan. Second question, what demand is there for you, for your experience, for your skill set? Essentially, how marketable are you if for whatever reason you wanted to do something different or something were to happen to your position? How easily or not could you pivot to another area of practice? And of course, factors like, is it one income in the household? Is there two incomes? How much flexibility do you have with your financial plan in terms of needing your income? And those questions, answering those questions, reflecting on those questions are important as I head into this final section as we talk about 10 steps to take right now with your financial plan to hedge against job loss or reduced hours. Okay, so number one, and we talked about these in episode 26 of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast. These are the baby steps in your financial plan. Number one is making sure you're doing everything you can to reduce your credit card debt, your consumer debt, to minimize it, get rid of it. And number two, to build an emergency fund, a rainy day fund, 3 to 6 months of expenses, so that if or when a job loss or financial hardship hits, you can weather that storm without taking on additional debt. And hopefully you can cash flow some of those expenses without disrupting the rest of your financial plan. So if you are listening today, struggling with consumer debt, credit card debt, or you don't yet have a solid emergency fund in place, that should be the number one thing. We talk about that in more detail on episode 26 if you want to go back and listen. Number two is not becoming house poor. Now, we've talked about this on various episodes related to home buying. I think is one of the biggest challenges that pharmacists face, is that their home and their home expenses can take up a significant percentage of their take-home pay. So for those that have not yet purchased a home, trying to purchase a home in a way that you can have as much discretionary income as possible. Obviously, you want to enjoy that piece as well. But for those of you that are in a home, what are some options that you have to potentially decrease that percent of your take-home pay that is going to your home each and every month through mortgage, through property taxes, through insurance, and through expenses that come with owning a home, right? Because what we're trying to think about here is if we can, let's say, take the percent of our take-home pay that goes to our home from 40% to down to 20%, obviously we just have more margin to achieve other goals, but also be ready to handle and to hedge ourselves against some of the negative aspects that could come from a job loss or reduced hours. So that could come through refinancing or restructuring a mortgage. Of course, that could be something more extreme like downsizing, but I think there's several options there that you can consider. Number three is making sure you understand your debt repayment plan and options. And here I'm specifically talking about the student loan debt for those that are still facing student loan debt. Now, why is this important as we talk about hedging against job loss or reduced hours? It's because there are so many options that are out there and available both in the federal system and the private system. So this could be different, right? Those of you that are pursuing loan forgiveness, those of you that are not, that certainly can depend how much is coming out of pocket each and every month. Is there an opportunity to pivot repayment plans if necessary to an income-driven repayment plan that might have a lower monthly payment, which of course could free up some cash flow? Is there an option to refinance in the private market and extend that repayment period, or refinance if you needed to and extend that repayment period so you could free up some of that monthly cash flow? And so if you're hearing this and you're wondering, have I evaluated all the options? Have I considered what's that one best option for my repayment plan? Do I have a good understanding so that if I had to make a pivot, I'm ready to do that? Please check out our latest resource written by Tim Church, The Pharmacist's Guide to Conquering Student Loans, available at pharmdloans.com. Number four is making early aggressive retirement savings if you can. So if you find yourself in the event of reduced hours, reduced pay, or job loss, obviously that time period is going to hinder your ability to save for retirement. So if you're able to make early aggressive retirement savings, you're going to be able to reap that continued benefit of compound interest that will come from those early savings that were made. So we talked at length during our investment series on episodes 72 through 76 on investing, all things investing, including retirement savings, vehicles to do that, priority of investing, understanding investing accounts. So I would encourage you to check that out. Number five is thinking of how you can diversify your income. Now, this could be through a side hustle. We've talked about these through the side hustle series in the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast. We featured stories of those that are doing medical writing. Most recently, we had Austin Ulbrich on the show who talked about this, Brittany Hoffman Eubanks, who talked about it in a previous episode. It could be a second part-time job that's in a different area of practice. So I've talked with many pharmacists that are working maybe 32 to 40 hours in a community setting and then have a PRN position in a hospital setting, which obviously gives them some diversification, not only additional income, but diversification into another area. Could also be through real estate, right? We've talked with several pharmacists on this show before that have done real estate and real estate investing in many different ways that has allowed them to produce some cash flow to achieve their financial goals, but also has helped to diversify their income. So diversification of income, I think, is an important consideration. Number six, and we're going to get into some of the softer sides here of the financial plan. Number six is networking. And we talked about this at length on episode 116 with David Burkus, author of Friend of a Friend. We talked about transforming your life and career through networking. And this is one of those things that is drilled into us while we're in pharmacy school, networking. but I think it often is hard to wrap your arms around the benefits that come through networking, whether that be collaboration in your job, whether that be staying sharp with your skills, whether that be, having somebody that you can lean on when you're in a difficult time that's going through perhaps a similar situation at work. But networking and the value of building your networking and the value that comes from that building is important to establish that before you have that dire need for that network, whether that because of reduced hours, job loss, or reduced pay, and you want to look at something else. So shout out here to the collaboration that we have with the American Pharmacists Association, that we provide personal finance education for APHA members. You can learn more at pharmacist.com/YFP. We offer 30% off YFP products and services to APHA members. And for those of you that are not yet an APHA member, make sure to check out that membership option, pharmacist.com. Use the coupon code YFP2020 for 25% off membership. Okay, number 7 is getting rid of those car payments. And this kind of goes along with the home buying, is we're trying to build margin in our financial plan. And so if we can get rid of those car payments or minimize those car payments, then obviously we're going to have more income to work with. And so way back when, we'll link to it in the show notes, I wrote a blog post, my top 10 financial mistakes. And number 7 was buying a car I had no business buying. Now, obviously we all make financial mistakes. I continue to make financial mistakes. And this is one of those that was not catastrophic, but really was something that wasn't needed and ultimately delayed our debt repayment plan. So 2014, Jess and I were still trying to get rid of our student loans. I bought a really nice used Lincoln MKX while I had a perfectly functioning and paid off Nissan Sentra with less than 50,000 miles on it. I ended up reselling the Lincoln MKX. No big deal. Actually used those proceeds ultimately to pay off student loans, but it was tax that I had to pay that I didn't need to pay. It was getting rid of a used off car, depreciating asset that I could have had. And if you look at right now, the average monthly payment on a new vehicle is now north of $500 a month. And so if you're somebody who's struggling with debt or getting better control of your monthly expenses, this is really an area I'd recommend you take a look at to see if there's an option to cut back or to pivot your car situation so that you can free up some of your monthly cash flow. Number 8 here is developing a plan to reshape your mindset. Really, knowledge is power when it comes to your financial plan. This could be through reading. This could be listening to podcasts such as this one. At the end of the day, the more you learn, the more you empower yourself, the more you put yourself in a position of really having a solid understanding of your financial plan and learning as much as you can about this, you're going to find yourself in the driver's seat. You're going to find yourself making decisions that are going to put you in control of your financial plan rather than external situations that are dictating your plan for you. Number 9 is surrounding yourself with individuals that will challenge you in a positive way and that share your same goals and vision. You've heard this before, that we tend to take on the behaviors, the beliefs, the actions of those that we're around most. And so here when we're talking about our finances, if you have a goal, let's say to achieve financial independence, if you have a goal to cut your expenses and reduce your lifestyle so that you can ultimately get to the things that are most important to you, surrounding yourself with folks that have a similar philosophy, that are spending their money, spending their time in a similar way, can have a profound impact on your own personal situation. So really evaluating who you're around. That could be certainly family, friends, making sure you have good accountability, jumping into groups like the YFP Facebook group where you've got folks that can encourage you, folks that can answer questions that you have, folks that can share in a win that you have with you. I think you'll find that to be really a significant impact on your financial plan. And number 10 is having a good plan and having a coach. Now, this obviously is self-serving, but I believe in this wholeheartedly. So obviously we offer one-on-one comprehensive financial planning at Your Financial Pharmacist. I'd encourage you to check it out, yfpplanning.com. You can schedule a free discovery call to learn more about our services, see if it's a good fit for you. Whether it's us or whether it's somebody else, and I hope it's us, having an accountability partner, having a coach, having somebody that can work with you one-on-one to help look at all of these various aspects of your financial plan and help you develop a strategy to how you can prioritize those and to help keep you accountable in that plan is incredibly, incredibly important. It's been significant for Jess and I in our own financial plan. We've seen it in many of our YFP clients. And I encourage you again, you can check that out, yfpplanning.com. But number 10 here is having a good plan, having a good coach, having a good accountability partner that will join you along the way. So that's a lot, right? We talked about some of the statistics of what we're facing as it relates to the pharmacy job market. Doesn't look great, right? Compared to what it was maybe 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. But we also talked about how to interpret that data. And the reality is we can't just look at that data and say it's gloom and doom. We need to look at the individual aspect of one's profession, of your situation, and really try to understand what is the true risk as it relates to your position, your area, and your financial plan. And then ultimately, what are some things? What are 10 things that we talked through that you can do right now to start hedging yourself against a potential reduction in hours, reduction in pay, or obviously worst case scenario there would be job loss. Now, the reality is those 10 things, even for those of you listening that say, you know what, I've got a secure job, I've got options, I've got diversified income. Those 10 things are 10 things that will benefit your financial plan, regardless of what you perceive to the outlook of your position going forward. As always, thank you so much for joining me on this week's episode of the podcast. If you haven't yet done so, please leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to the show each and every week. And if you haven't yet joined us in the YFP Facebook group, I hope you will. Over 6,000 pharmacy professionals that are committed to helping one another on their path towards achieving financial freedom. Have a great rest of your week.